The last ship arrived on a Tuesday, though no one was counting days anymore. It drifted into Bristol's harbour with torn sails and a crew of 4 where 20 should have been, carrying news that made the silence even deeper. Venice had burned, not from war, but because there was no one left to stop a single candle from becoming an inferno. The survivors who gathered at the dock that morning, perhaps 36 souls in a city that once held 30,000, understood then what they had been trying not to believe. The world they had known was truly gone, and they were the inheritors of its ruins. The great dying, as those who survived would come to call it, did not end with a single moment of relief. There was no morning when people woke to find the pestilence had vanished like a nightmare dissolved by dawn. Instead, it faded the way a fire fades when it has consumed everything that can burn, leaving behind a landscape so transformed that those who remained could barely recognize it as the world they had inhabited just years before. Between 1348 and 1353, something like 100 million people died across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. In some places, half the population vanished. In others, 9 out of every 10 souls departed, leaving villages full of empty houses and fields returning to wilderness. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel, but this is not a story about the dying itself. This is about what came after, about the years that followed when the survivors stood amid the wreckage and had to decide what came next. These are the years nobody remembers, the decades after the Great Plague, when humanity reassembled itself in the shadow of catastrophe, when the world was remade not by kings or great councils, but by ordinary people making 1,000 small decisions about how to live in a reality fundamentally altered. The immediate aftermath was silence. Those who lived through the plague's final waves described it consistently, the overwhelming quiet that descended when the dying finally stopped. In cities that had once rung with the calls of merchants, the songs of workers, the bells marking every hour of prayer and commerce, there was suddenly a stillness so profound it felt like a physical presence. London, which had held perhaps 80,000 souls before the pestilence, now contained fewer than 20,000. Paris, once home to 200,000 people, had lost more than half. The great cities of Italy, centers of learning and trade that had pulled the continent toward Renaissance, were hollowed out, their streets empty, their workshops silent. In the countryside, the transformation was even more stark. Entire villages stood abandoned, their fields already beginning to sprout with wild growth. The precise agricultural landscape that had been carved out over centuries, where every acre had its purpose and every harvest was accounted for, started to blur back into something wilder. Without hands to maintain them, hedgerows grew into thickets, drainage ditches filled with sediment and became marshes again. The forest edge, which had been pushed back generation by generation as populations grew and demanded more farmland, began its slow advance toward the empty houses and barns. For the survivors, the first challenge was simply material existence. The plague had not discriminated in its victims. Lords died alongside serfs, priests alongside beggars, skilled craftsmen alongside laborers. The complex web of knowledge and skill that kept medieval society functioning had been shredded. A village that lost its blacksmith might have no one who could repair tools or shoe horses. A manor that lost its steward might have no one who understood the cycles of planting and harvest. A monastery that lost its abbot and half its monks might lose centuries of accumulated learning. In those first months and years after the dying slowed, communities had to take inventory of what remained, not just of material goods, though that was critical, but of knowledge and capability. Who was left? Who could do the essential work? Who knew how to grind grain or brew ale, how to slaughter animals or preserve meat, how to deliver babies or set broken bones? The answers were often terrifying. Skills that had been passed from master to apprentice, father to son, mother to daughter. were simply gone, carried away by the plague like everything else. Food became the immediate concern. The harvest of 1349 was a disaster across much of Europe, not because of weather or blight, but because there were not enough hands to bring it in. Fields of grain stood ready for harvesting, with no one to wield the sickle. Fruit rotted on trees. Without enough people to tend them through winter, livestock died or went feral. Survivors in some regions faced the bitter irony of potential plenty, surrounded by actual starvation, of fields full of food they could not harvest, of livestock they could not manage. Those who did survive found themselves in a strange new relationship with resources. In the world before the plague, scarcity had been the dominant reality for most people. There was never quite enough land, never quite enough food, never quite enough of anything to go around comfortably. The population had been pressing against the limits of what the medieval economy could support. Now, suddenly, there was abundance of a kind. Too many houses, too many tools, too much land for the people remaining. A survivor might walk through their village and choose from a dozen empty cottages. They might take tools from workshops whose owners had died, claim fields that had no one left to work them. This abundance was not without its complications. Property law in the medieval world was complex, based on intricate systems of obligation and inheritance. Who owned an empty house? The dead man's distant cousin 3 villages away, the lord who held ultimate title to all land in his domain, the neighbor who had actually moved in and started keeping the roof repaired. These questions, multiplied across thousands of locations, created a legal chaos that would take decades to sort out, and in many cases never would be fully resolved. The relationship between survivors and the dead became its own strange territory. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, when the dying had been happening so fast that proper burial became impossible, there had been mass graves, hasty disposal, bodies burned or simply abandoned. Now, with time to think, communities had to decide what to do with the physical remnants of catastrophe. Some churches held memorial services for entire parishes. Some communities marked mass graves with simple stones or crosses. Others tried to forget, to move past the horror without marking or memorializing it. Personal grief was complicated by the sheer scale of loss. How did one mourn when everyone was mourning? When there was not a single family untouched by death, not a single person who had not lost parent or child, sibling or spouse, friend or neighbor. The rituals of mourning that had provided structure and meaning in normal times felt inadequate to the magnitude of loss. Some people retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to speak of what they had endured. Others became almost manic in their need to testify, to tell the stories of those who had died, to insist that the dead be remembered and honored. The psychological weight of survival was itself a kind of burden. Many who lived through the plague described a persistent guilt, a question that haunted them. Why did I survive when so many died? There had been no pattern to who lived and who died that anyone could discern. The young and healthy died alongside the old and infirm. The pious died alongside the wicked. Some families were entirely wiped out while their neighbors, living in identical conditions, somehow survived intact. This randomness, this lack of meaning or justice in who was taken and who was spared, was in some ways harder to bear than the deaths themselves. Religion, which should have provided comfort and explanation, was instead thrown into crisis. The plague had shaken fundamental beliefs about divine justice and providence. If God was benevolent and just, why had he allowed such suffering? The standard explanations that the plague was punishment for sin, a call to repentance, had satisfied some during the worst of the dying, but in its aftermath rang hollow. Everyone had sinned, but not everyone had died. The righteous had perished alongside the wicked. Children, innocents by any measure, had died in numbers beyond counting. Some turned away from religion entirely, deciding that if God existed, he was either powerless or cruel, and in either case not worthy of devotion. Others doubled down on faith, deciding that divine will was beyond human understanding, and that questioning was itself a kind of sin. Still others tried to find new ways of understanding, seeking meaning in traditions, outside mainstream Christianity, or developing new interpretations of old doctrines. The church itself was in disarray. Monasteries and convents had been hit particularly hard by the plague, their communal living arrangements making them perfect vectors for disease transmission. Some religious houses lost every single member. Others survived with just a handful of monks or nuns rattling around in buildings meant for dozens or hundreds. The loss of these communities was not just spiritual but intellectual. Monasteries had been the repositories of learning, the places where books were copied and preserved, where the accumulated knowledge of centuries was maintained. When a monastery died, its library might be scattered or lost entirely. Books left to mold in abandoned rooms or used as kindling by survivors who saw more value in warmth than in learning. The surviving clergy faced their own crisis of authority. Why should people listen to priests who had been unable to stop the plague or explain it? Many priests had died, it was true, having stayed to minister to the sick while others fled. But many had also fled, abandoning their flocks when comfort was most needed. The moral authority of the church, already strained by corruption and worldliness before the plague, was further undermined by its helplessness in the face of catastrophe. Into this vacuum of authority and certainty came various movements and responses. Some were expressions of desperate piety, like the flagellants who had wandered Europe during the worst of the plague, whipping themselves in public displays of penance. These groups mostly faded away as the plague receded, but the impulse they represented, a desire for direct, visceral religious experience outside the mediation of corrupt clergy, would resurface again and again in the decades to come. Others' responses were darker. The plague years had seen terrible pogroms against Jewish communities, blamed by some Christians for the pestilence, despite the obvious fact that Jews were dying in equal or greater proportion. This scapegoating didn't end with the plague. In the aftermath, some communities that had lost their Jewish neighbors in violence had to grapple with what they had done, while others simply absorbed the murdered people's property and moved on. The ease with which communities had turned to violence, the speed with which neighbors had become murderers, left its own scar on the collective psyche. The economic disruption caused by the plague would reshape European society in ways that would only become clear over decades. In the immediate aftermath, trade collapsed. The networks of commerce that had connected Europe to itself and to the wider world were torn apart. Merchants who had spent lifetimes building relationships and establishing routes were dead. Ships sat in harbors with no crews to sail them. Markets that had operated for generations simply stopped functioning. But this collapse created opportunity as well as chaos. The survivors who had skills or goods found themselves in sudden demand. A weaver who might have been one of dozens in their town might now be the only one able to name their price for cloth. A mason who had struggled to find work might now have more commissions than they could possibly fulfill, with so many buildings in need of repair and so few people capable of doing the work. This shift in the balance between labor and capital was perhaps the plague's most significant long-term economic impact. Before the pestilence, labor had been cheap and abundant. Land had been scarce and valuable. Now those proportions reversed. Land that would have been precious before the plague could be had for little or nothing. There simply weren't enough people to work at all. Labor, meanwhile, became valuable in ways it had never been before. Landowners and employers who were used to dictating terms to workers found themselves in a strange new position. Workers could demand higher wages, better conditions, more freedom, because they knew they had options. If a lord refused to meet their terms, they could walk away and find another lord who would, or simply strike out on their own, claiming vacant land and working it for themselves. This shift terrified the ruling classes. Laws were passed attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, to prevent workers from moving between employers in search of better terms, to maintain the old social order by force of law. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 tried to accomplish exactly this, mandating that workers accept the same wages they had received before the plague, and prohibiting them from leaving their home parishes to seek better opportunities elsewhere. These laws were largely unenforceable. There were simply not enough officials to police every transaction, to prevent every worker from seeking a better situation. More fundamentally, the economic reality was too strong to be suppressed by legislation. Landowners who wanted their fields worked, merchants who needed goods produced, households that required servants, all of them found themselves having to compete for labor. And competition meant higher wages and better conditions, whether the law allowed it or not. The tensions between what the law said and what economic reality demanded would simmer throughout the second half of the 14th century, eventually erupting in revolts and uprisings as working people tried to claim in law what they had already gained in practice. But in the immediate aftermath of the plague, most people were too focused on basic survival to think much about political philosophy or social revolution. Daily life in the years after the plague had a makeshift quality. Communities that had lost too many people to maintain their previous ways of life had to improvise new arrangements. Villages that had supported a church, a mill, a blacksmith, and various craftsmen might now have none of these things, requiring people to travel to neighboring settlements for services or to teach themselves skills they had never needed to know before. Women found themselves taking on roles that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Widows ran businesses, managed estates, practiced trades. The rigid gender divisions that had characterized medieval society loosened out of necessity. There simply weren't enough men to do all the work designated as men's work, and survival mattered more than propriety. Some of these changes would prove temporary, reimposed as populations recovered and social norms reasserted themselves, but others became permanent, expanding the sphere of what was considered appropriate or possible for women. Children who had survived the plague faced their own particular challenges. Many were orphans, their parents and often their entire extended families dead. In some cases, communities tried to absorb these children, parceling them out to surviving families who could raise them. In others, children formed their own makeshift households, older siblings caring for younger, trying to maintain farms or workshops with knowledge gained from watching their dead parents work. The psychological impact on these children, growing up in a world emptied of adults, of normal family structures, of the web of relationships that should have surrounded and supported them, is difficult to fully imagine. They had seen things no child should see, had experienced losses that would have broken many adults, yet they were also resilient in ways that seem almost superhuman from our perspective. They learned to do what needed doing, to carry on because carrying on was the only option. The natural world responded to the plague's transformation of human society in ways both subtle and dramatic. Without human management, domesticated landscapes began reverting to wildness. But this was not a simple return to some pristine state. The medieval landscape was already thoroughly shaped by human activity. Forests had been cleared, wetlands drained, species introduced or eliminated based on human needs and preferences. What emerged in the plague's aftermath was not the pre-human landscape, but something new, a hybrid state that reflected both the intensive management that had come before and the sudden cessation of that management. Some animals thrived. Deer populations exploded in forests that had been carefully managed hunting preserves, but now lacked the gamekeepers who had controlled their numbers. Wild boar returned to regions they had been extirpated from. Wolves, which had been pushed to the margins of settled areas, began expanding their range again, finding easy prey in livestock that had gone feral. Other species suffered. Animals that had depended on human activity, rats and mice that lived in grain stores, birds that nested in maintained buildings, plants that grew in cultivated fields, found their ecological niches disrupted. The plague had created an ecological catastrophe alongside the human one, reshuffling the relationships between species in ways that would take generations to settle into new equilibriums. The climate during this period added its own challenges. The medieval warm period was giving way to what would later be called the Little Ice Age, a cooling trend that would last for centuries. Winters became harsher, summers less reliable. Growing seasons shortened, making agriculture more precarious just when communities were trying to rebuild their food production systems with reduced labor forces. This climatic shift was not caused by the plague, but its timing compounded the challenges facing survivors. Survivors also had to navigate the practical challenges of maintaining infrastructure with greatly reduced populations. Water systems, roads, bridges, city walls, all required constant maintenance to remain functional. Before the plague, this maintenance had been spread across large populations, part of the background work of keeping civilization running. Now, with so many fewer people, communities had to make hard choices about what to maintain and what to let decay. Some communities prioritized defensive walls, fearing that their weakness would make them targets for raiders or rival powers. Others focused on agricultural infrastructure, the mills and irrigation systems that made food production possible. Still others chose to retreat, abandoning outer districts or satellite settlements to consolidate their reduced populations in more defensible or sustainable spaces. The landscape of Europe in the decades after the plague was full of these abandoned spaces, neighborhoods, and villages that had simply been walked away from because there weren't enough people to make them viable. Cultural production in the aftermath of the plague reflected the trauma and transformation societies were experiencing. Art became more focused on death, more explicit in its depictions of mortality. The danse macabre, the dance of death showing skeletons leading people of all social classes to the grave, became a popular motif. Tomb sculptures shifted from idealized images of the deceased at rest to transi tombs showing the body in various states of decay, a memento mori carved in stone. Literature grappled with questions of meaning and justice in a world that had revealed itself to be arbitrary and cruel. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years themselves, framed stories of human folly and wisdom against the backdrop of the pestilence, creating art from catastrophe. Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the plague, channeled his grief into poetry that would influence European literature for centuries. The visual arts saw shifts in patronage and subject matter. With so many noble and wealthy families extinguished, some artistic commissions simply disappeared. But new patrons emerged, including merchants and guilds who had gained wealth and power in the plague's aftermath and sought to commemorate their rise through artistic patronage. Religious art became more emotional, more focused on suffering and redemption, reflecting a theology that had been tested by catastrophe. Music, too, transformed. The elaborate polyphonic masses that had been developing before the plague continued, but with new emotional depths. Requiem masses, music for the dead, became increasingly important as communities sought to memorialize those they had lost. Secular music took on both darker and more exuberant tones, reflecting both grief and the desperate celebration of those who had survived. Education faced a crisis as schools and universities struggled to continue with depleted faculty and student bodies. Some universities closed temporarily or permanently, others persisted but changed their character, as the careful preservation and transmission of classical learning gave way to more practical concerns. Students who survived the plague often advanced more rapidly than they would have in normal times, simply because there were so few of them and so many positions that needed filling. The practice of medicine was thoroughly discredited by its helplessness in the face of plague, yet also desperately needed. Physicians who had been unable to cure or even understand the pestilence found their theories questioned by patients who had no reason to trust in authorities that had proved so comprehensively wrong. Folk healing, herbalism, and magical practices gained ground, offering at least the comfort of doing something even if that something was ineffective. Some physicians responded to the plague's challenge by beginning to question received wisdom more thoroughly, to observe and experiment rather than simply consulting ancient texts. This empirical turn would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution, though that was still centuries away. In the immediate aftermath, it mostly meant a proliferation of competing theories and treatments, none of them effective, but all representing attempts to make sense of what had happened. Legal systems had to adapt to unprecedented situations. Inheritance law, for instance, was based on the assumption that a relatively predictable succession of generations would pass property from parents to children with well-established rules for what happened in exceptional cases. But when entire families were wiped out, when there were no obvious heirs, when distant relatives disputed claims to property they had never expected to inherit, The existing legal frameworks proved inadequate. Courts were clogged with cases trying to sort out these tangles. Who inherited when a man, his wife, and all their children died within days of each other, and there was no way to determine the order of death? What happened to property when the only surviving heir was a woman, and law or custom said she could not inherit? What claims did surviving siblings have against each other when their parents' will had anticipated a very different distribution among many children? These questions were not merely technical. They represented real struggles by real people trying to secure their futures in an uncertain world. A widow fighting for the right to continue her husband's business might be fighting for her survival and that of her children. A young man claiming his uncle's farm might be trying to avoid destitution. The legal battles were often proxy wars for larger questions about social order and justice in a transformed world. In the cities, guilds and corporations had to reconstitute themselves with depleted memberships. Some crafts lost so many masters and journeymen that they could barely function. Apprenticeship systems, which had been based on young people learning over years under experienced masters, collapsed when there were too few masters and too few apprentices. Some guilds loosened their requirements, allowing people to practice crafts they were only partially trained in out of necessity. Others tried to maintain standards even as they contracted, preserving quality at the cost of quantity. The balance of power between guilds, merchants, and nobility shifted as well. Guilds in some cities gained political power they had never held before, their members essential to urban survival and function in ways that gave them leverage they had previously lacked. Merchants who had survived and maintained their networks became extraordinarily wealthy, able to operate in markets that had less competition and more demand than ever before. Rural areas saw their own power shifts. The manorial system, which had organized agricultural life for centuries, came under pressure from both above and below. Lords who needed labor to work their lands found themselves having to offer better terms to attract workers. Peasants who had leverage for the first time in generations used it to negotiate for freedom from various obligations, for the right to move, for the commutation of labor services into money rents. Some lords adapted to this new reality, accepting that the old order was gone and negotiating new arrangements with their peasants. Others resisted fiercely, trying to maintain feudal obligations through force or legal coercion. These resistance efforts would eventually provoke violent responses, rebellions, and uprisings as peasants fought to keep gains they had made in the plague's aftermath. The question of freedom versus obligation became central to social conflict in the late 14th century. Before the plague, most rural people in Europe had been unfree to various degrees. Serfs bound to the land, required to provide labor to their lords, restricted in their movements and choices. The plague had created practical freedom for many, as lords lacked the power to enforce old obligations. But legal freedom was another matter, and securing it required struggle. In England, this tension would culminate in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when rural workers and urban artisans rose up demanding the end of serfdom and the recognition of their rights. The revolt was ultimately crushed, its leaders executed, but it marked a point of no return. Serfdom in England would gradually fade over the following century, not because of a single decree, but through the accumulated weight of economic and social changes that the plague had accelerated. Similar tensions and conflicts played out across Europe, each region negotiating the transition from the pre-plague social order to whatever would come next. In some places, the transition was relatively peaceful, accomplished through negotiation and gradual change. In others, it was violent, marked by uprisings, repressions, and cycles of conflict that would last for generations. The psychological landscape of post-plague Europe was marked by both trauma and possibility. People had survived something that had seemed like the end of the world. They had watched their societies collapse and had begun the work of rebuilding. This experience was both terrifying and, for some, liberating. The old certainties were gone, but that meant new possibilities were open. Some people retreated into conservatism, trying to restore what had been lost, to recreate the world as it had existed before the plague. They saw the transformation of society as something to be resisted and reversed, a falling away from proper order that needed to be corrected. These people would fight rearguard actions for decades, trying to freeze wages, enforce old obligations, maintain hierarchies that were crumbling beneath them. Others embraced change, seeing in the plague's devastation an opportunity to build something new. They experimented with new forms of social organization, new economic arrangements, new religious practices. They asked questions that would have been unthinkable before. Why should some people be free and others bound? Why should wealth and power follow birth rather than merit? Why should religious truth be monopolized by a corrupt clergy rather than accessible to all believers? These questions would not be fully answered in the decades immediately following the plague, but asking them, making them thinkable, was itself revolutionary. The plague had broken the world's shell, and what emerged from the breaking was not the same creature that had gone in. Trade began to recover slowly, networks reforming link by link as merchants who had survived or who entered the business after the plague began to re-establish roots and relationships. But trade did not simply return to its previous patterns. New players had entered the game, taking advantage of opportunities created by the death of established merchants. New routes developed, bypassing cities that had been devastated beyond recovery. New goods became important, and old ones faded in significance. The balance of trade between regions shifted. Cities and regions that had been economically marginal before the plague sometimes surged ahead, while former powerhouses struggled to maintain their positions. Venice and Genoa, the great Italian maritime republics, continued to dominate Mediterranean trade, but faced increasing competition from merchants in other regions. The Hanseatic League, the confederation of merchant guilds and towns in northern Europe, expanded its influence, controlling trade across the Baltic and North Seas. Agricultural practices evolved in response to labor scarcity. With fewer workers available, there was pressure to find more efficient methods of farming or to shift to less labor-intensive forms of production. In England, this contributed to a shift from arable farming to sheep raising, as pasture required far fewer workers than crops. This shift would have profound consequences, including the enclosure movements that would eventually force many people off the land and into cities, contributing to the urbanization that would characterize later centuries. The conversion of arable land to pasture was not merely an economic decision, but a social and political one with winners and losers. Landowners who made this conversion could profit handsomely from wool production while employing far fewer workers. But those workers who were displaced had nowhere to go, no way to maintain themselves in a rural economy that no longer needed them. This displacement would contribute to social tensions and would ultimately change the character of English society. Technology and innovation received new impetus from the labor shortage. If workers were expensive and hard to find, there was incentive to develop tools and techniques that could accomplish more with less human effort. Windmills and watermills became more common, taking over tasks that had previously required human or animal power. Improvements in tools and agricultural implements made individual workers more productive. The printing press, which would arrive in Europe in the mid-15th century, would have been less revolutionary in a world where labor was cheap and abundant. Copying books by hand was labor-intensive, but when labor was cheap, that was acceptable. In a world where labor was expensive, a technology that could multiply books without multiplying copyists had obvious appeal. The plague did not cause the printing press, but it helped create conditions where such an innovation would be rapidly adopted and exploited. The years after the plague saw strange juxtapositions of wealth and poverty, plenty and want. A skilled craftsman might live better than minor nobility had before the plague, enjoying abundant food, comfortable housing, the ability to purchase goods that would have been luxuries in an earlier time. Yet they might live in a city half empty, walking past abandoned houses on their way to work, their prosperity built on the graves of those who had died. This simultaneous experience of loss and gain created a complex emotional landscape. Survivors' guilt mingled with gratitude. Grief coexisted with opportunity. People were enriched by inheritances they would rather not have received, advanced to positions they would never have reached if those ahead of them had not died. The moral ambiguity of surviving, of profiting from catastrophe, weighed on some people while others simply accepted it as the way of the world. Religious life continued to evolve in response to the plague's challenge. New saints' cults developed around figures who had died ministering to plague victims or who were believed to offer protection against disease. Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch became particularly popular as plague saints, their images appearing in churches and shrines across Europe. The veneration of these saints offered a way to make sense of the plague, to incorporate it into the existing framework of faith rather than having to reject that framework entirely. Pilgrimage became increasingly important as a religious practice in the decades after the plague. People traveled to shrines seeking healing, giving thanks for survival, or simply trying to make sense of what they had experienced through movement and devotion. The great pilgrimage routes, to Santiago de Compostela, to Rome, to Jerusalem, saw renewed traffic as people sought meaning through physical and spiritual journey. Mysticism flourished in the post-plague world. Mystics like Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena offered direct personal religious experiences that did not require mediation by a clergy whose authority had been undermined. Their visions and writings spoke to people seeking connection with the divine outside traditional institutional channels. The popularity of mysticism represented both a critique of the Church and a deepening of faith, a search for authentic spirituality in a time when institutional religion seemed inadequate. The Black Death had demonstrated that the Church could neither predict nor prevent catastrophe, that prayers and processions were as helpless before plague as any other human activity. This realization could have led to mass abandonment of Christianity. Instead, for most people, it led to a restructuring of how they thought about faith and divine action. God had not prevented the plague, but perhaps prevention was not his purpose. Perhaps suffering was itself meaningful in ways humans could not fully understand. Perhaps survival was grace, even if arbitrary grace. The doctrine of predestination gained new attention in the wake of the plague. If survival was random, if there was no pattern to who died and who lived, perhaps it was because God had already chosen who would be saved and who would be damned, and the plague was simply a mechanism of that selection. This was not a comforting theology, but it had the virtue of offering an explanation when other explanations failed. The decades after the plague also saw increased interest in apocalyptic prophecy and millennialism. Some believed the plague had been a sign of the end times, that Christ's return was imminent. When that return did not immediately occur, some believers recalculated, finding new significance in dates and events, new signs in the heavens and on earth that the eschaton was approaching. This apocalyptic mood would wax and wane, but never entirely disappear, coloring religious and political movements for the rest of the Middle Ages and beyond. Families reconstituted themselves in new configurations. A widow with children might marry a widower with children of his own, creating blended families that had to navigate complex relationships and loyalties. Orphans were absorbed into extended families or into the households of non-relatives. The nuclear family, which had been the basic unit of society, became more fluid, more permeable, as survival required flexibility in who counted as family and who had obligations to whom. Property and inheritance flowed in unexpected directions. A peasant might inherit land from a distant cousin, elevating them to a status they would never have achieved in normal times. A merchant's daughter, expected to marry a merchant's son, might find herself the only heir to her father's business, taking on a role that would have been unthinkable for a woman before the plague. These individual transformations, multiplied across thousands of families, changed the social landscape in ways that no law or policy could have accomplished. The pace of life slowed in some ways and accelerated in others. Agricultural rhythms continued as they always had. Planting and harvest could not wait for human convenience. But the frenetic quality of the late medieval economy, where markets had been crowded and competition fierce, eased. There was less pressure, less crowding, less of the sense that one was always scrambling for survival in a world that had no space to spare. The harvest season progressed through September and October, with the entire village focused on bringing in the crops that would determine whether the coming winter was comfortable or desperate. The weather cooperated mostly, enough sun, enough rain, not too much of either, and the yields were good, not exceptional but solid. enough to pay the rent and the tithes and feed the household and still have something left to sell at market. The Harvest Festival in late October was a village-wide celebration, a thanksgiving for successful crops and a communal affirmation of survival and continuity. There was a special church service, a feast with better food than usual, music and dancing in the village square. Everyone participated, men and women, adults and children, rich and poor by village standards. Old Catherine watched the festivities with pleasure and a touch of sadness, knowing this might be her last harvest festival, knowing that her time was drawing to a close. She had seen more than 60 harvest festivals in her life, had participated in the rituals that marked the agricultural year, the spring planting, the summer growth, the autumn harvest, the winter rest. These cycles had structured her experience, had given rhythm and meaning to existence, had connected her to the land and the community and the generations that had worked this land before her. Young Catherine danced with the other children, her face flushed and happy, entirely present in the moment, not thinking about past or future, but simply experiencing the joy of movement and music and community. Old Catherine envied her that presence, that ability to be fully in the now, without the weight of memory and anticipation. But she also valued her own longer perspective, her ability to see patterns and connections, to understand how this moment fit into larger stories of change and continuity. As winter approached and the days shortened, life in the village shifted to indoor work and shorter hours. The fields were prepared for winter, the last crops harvested, the animals brought into barns and shelters. Households turned to tasks that could be done inside, spinning and weaving, tool repair and maintenance, the endless work of keeping clothes and equipment functional through another season. Old Catherine spent more time by the fire, her joints aching from the cold and damp, her energy declining. She continued to work. Her hands were rarely idle, but at a slower pace, with more breaks for rest. She could feel her body failing, feel the approach of death, and she tried to prepare herself and her family for her passing. "I won't see another spring," she told Mary one December afternoon as they sat together, spinning. "I can feel it. My time is ending." Mary protested, said her mother was strong and would recover with the warmer weather, but both of them knew the truth. Catherine was old and tired, ready to let go, ready to join the ancestors who had gone before. "I'm not afraid," Catherine said. "I've had a long life, a good life in many ways. I've seen my children grow and have children of their own. I've contributed what I could to this household and this village. I'm ready to rest." "What should we tell young Catherine?" Mary asked. "How do we help her understand?" "Tell her the truth," old Catherine said. "Tell her that I've lived my time and now it's ending, that this is the natural way of things, that all lives end, but the chain continues. Tell her about the plague and how it changed the world. Tell her about her ancestors and what they survived. Tell her that life is precious and should not be wasted." As Christmas approached, the village prepared for the religious festival that marked the darkest time of year, the celebration of Christ's birth that brought light and hope to the winter darkness. The church was decorated with evergreen branches, candles were lit, the Mass was sung with particular devotion. Old Catherine attended the Christmas Mass, wrapped in warm clothing, supported by her family. She prayed with the others, participated in the familiar rituals, felt connected to the long tradition of Christian worship that stretched back centuries, connected to all the people who had gathered in this church over generations, connected to the great community of believers across time and space. She knew these were likely her last prayers in this church where she had been baptized, and married where her children had been baptized, where she had attended Mass every week for more than 60 years. The building itself was ancient, parts of it dating from before the Norman conquest, stones that had been shaped and placed by people whose names were forgotten but whose work endured. This endurance of physical structures beyond individual lives gave Catherine some comfort. The church would stand after she was gone, would continue to serve the community, would remain as a marker and a gathering place. The house where she lived would shelter future generations of her family. The village itself would continue, adapting and changing but maintaining some essential continuity with the past. As the year 1448 turned to 1449, old Catherine's health declined further. She spent most of her time by the fire, too weak for much physical work, but still mentally sharp, still able to talk and tell stories, still valued as a source of wisdom and memory. Young Catherine spent considerable time with her grandmother during these weeks, sensing perhaps that the time was limited, wanting to be close to this woman who had always been a presence in her life. They talked about many things, about the past and the future, about the village and the wider world, about what mattered and how to live well. "Remember that you come from survivors," old Catherine told her granddaughter. "Your ancestors lived through the worst catastrophe Europe has ever seen, and they kept going, kept building, kept creating life and meaning even in the face of death. That's in you, that strength and resilience. Whatever challenges you face, remember that you come from people who survived the plague." These were among old Catherine's last words passed on to a girl who would carry them into her own old age, who would eventually tell them to her own grandchildren, maintaining the chain of memory and meaning that connected the generations. Old Catherine died in early February of 1449, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family. Her death was mourned but not unexpected, and the household and village moved through the familiar rituals, the preparation of the body, the wake, the funeral mass, the burial in the churchyard, alongside her ancestors. Young Catherine cried at her grandmother's funeral, feeling the loss even though she was too young to fully understand death, feeling the absence of someone who had been a constant presence in her life. But she also absorbed the lessons her grandmother had taught, the stories and wisdom that would shape her own understanding of the world, that would influence how she lived her own life and raised her own children. Yet, in other ways, life accelerated. People who would have spent years as apprentices found themselves masters in months out of necessity. Social mobility that would have taken generations could happen in years or even months. Someone born a peasant might die a landowner. Someone born a craftsman's daughter might die a merchant's widow running her own enterprise. The plague had shaken society like a jar full of different colored sand, and when it settled, the layers were mixed in new patterns. Art and architecture reflected these social transformations. Churches built in the decades after the plague often incorporated images of death and judgment more prominently than earlier buildings had. The danse macabre appeared on church walls, reminding parishioners that death came for all regardless of status. Tomb sculptures became more elaborate, more focused on individual identity and achievement, as people who had risen through their own efforts sought to memorialize themselves in stone. Secular buildings, too, showed changes. Merchants and guild members who had gained wealth and status built houses that proclaimed their success, structures that would have been considered inappropriate for their class before the plague. The visual landscape of cities changed as new money asserted itself in architecture, challenging the old association between nobility and grandeur. Literature in the vernacular languages, Italian, French, English, German, flourished in the post-plague years. Latin remained the language of the church and of scholarship, but increasingly important works were being written in languages ordinary people could read. This shift had begun before the plague, but the plague accelerated it by disrupting the educational systems that had maintained Latin's dominance and by creating audiences hungry for literature in languages they understood. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, captured the social transformations of the post-plague world through its diverse cast of pilgrims, from knight to peasant, from refined prioress to bawdy wife of Bath. The tales showed a society in flux where old hierarchies persisted but were being questioned and negotiated, where people of different classes could travel together and tell each other stories as something approaching equals. The concept of social class itself was being renegotiated. Before the plague, society had been imagined as three estates or orders: those who prayed, clergy; those who fought, nobility; and those who worked, everyone else. This tripartite division had never been perfectly accurate, but it had provided a framework for understanding social organization. After the plague, this framework became increasingly inadequate to describe a society where merchants might be wealthier than nobles, where peasants might own more land than knights, where women might run businesses and craftsmen might commission artwork. New social categories emerged or became more prominent. The idea of a middle class of prosperous merchants, successful craftsmen, and substantial landowners who were neither nobility nor peasantry began to coalesce. This group would become increasingly important in shaping economic and eventually political life, their interests and perspectives challenging the old aristocratic monopoly on power and prestige. Urban life took on new characteristics as cities rebuilt their populations. Some cities actively recruited new inhabitants, offering favorable terms to attract craftsmen and laborers. Immigrants from the countryside brought rural perspectives and practices into urban settings, changing city cultures. Meanwhile, younger sons of rural families who would have had no prospects before the plague could now hope to find opportunity in cities where labor was valued and advancement possible. The relationship between city and countryside shifted. Before the plague, cities had been somewhat parasitic, drawing resources and people from rural areas while offering relatively little in return besides markets for agricultural goods. Now, cities became engines of opportunity, places where people could rise based on skill and effort rather than birth. This made them attractive destinations for ambitious rural people, draining talent from the countryside even as it enriched cities. Guilds had to adapt their structures to new realities. With fewer masters and fewer apprentices, the traditional progression from apprentice to journeyman to master had to be compressed or modified. Some guilds lowered their standards for admission, allowing people to become masters with less training than would have been required before. Others maintained high standards but found themselves with very few members, exclusive but increasingly irrelevant. Women's participation in guilds increased in the decades after the plague. Some guilds had always allowed women to continue their deceased husbands' businesses. Now, with labor scarce, some went further, accepting women as full members in their own right. The extent of this change varied widely by region and craft, and much of it would be rolled back as populations recovered and male workers sought to exclude competition. But for a time, women found opportunities in crafts and trades that had previously been closed to them. The institution of marriage evolved in subtle ways. With so many deaths, remarriage became extremely common. A person might be married multiple times over their lifetime, creating complex networks of step relationships and half-siblings. The emotional tenor of marriage may have shifted as well, with more emphasis on companionship between spouses who had chosen each other rather than being chosen by their families, though arranged marriages certainly continued to be the norm in many contexts. Childhood and adolescence took on different contours in the post-plague world. Young people who survived faced a world where adults were scarce and opportunities abundant. They might advance to positions of responsibility and authority at ages that would have been considered too young in earlier times. A 15-year-old running a farm or a workshop would have been unusual before the plague, but became common in its aftermath. This early assumption of adult responsibilities may have changed the experience of youth itself. Children in the post-plague world could not afford the extended period of dependency and training that had characterized youth in more stable times. They had to grow up fast, to take on burdens they were barely ready for, to make decisions with consequences they could hardly understand. Education of the young became more haphazard. With so many teachers dead, with schools and universities disrupted, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next could not proceed as smoothly as it had before. Some knowledge was simply lost. Skills and learning that depended on face-to-face teaching from master to student and could not be recovered from books. Other knowledge was preserved but transformed, passed on imperfectly, or adapted to new circumstances. The natural world continued its own recovery and transformation. Forests expanded into abandoned farmland, reclaiming territory that had been cleared centuries before. Wildlife populations rebounded, finding more space and less human pressure than they had experienced in generations. Rivers that had been straightened and channeled for human use began to meander again, creating new wetlands and changing landscapes. This ecological recovery was not simply beneficial. Forests that expanded into farmland created new habitats for disease vectors, for wolves and other predators, for wild boars that could destroy crops. Wetlands that reformed bred mosquitoes and other pests. The boundary between civilization and wilderness, which had been so carefully maintained for centuries, became blurred and uncertain. a source of both resource and threat. Climate change, in the form of the advancing Little Ice Age, added its own pressures. Summers became cooler and wetter, winters longer and harsher, growing seasons shortened, making it harder to produce food even with the reduced populations. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had already demonstrated the vulnerability of medieval agriculture to climate variation. Now, with fewer people to work the land and less favorable conditions, food security remained precarious. The cooling climate affected different regions differently. Areas that were marginal for agriculture even in good times, the highlands of Scotland, the mountains of Scandinavia, became nearly uninhabitable. Settlements that had existed for generations were abandoned as people retreated to more favorable locations. The retreat of the settlement frontier, which had been expanding for centuries as population grew, was another marker of how much the plague had changed the world. Innovation in agriculture became necessary for survival. Communities experimented with new crops, new techniques, new ways of organizing labor to get the most from their limited workforce. Some of these innovations succeeded and spread. Others failed and were abandoned. The process was one of trial and error, guided more by necessity than by any systematic approach to agricultural improvement. The relationship between humans and animals shifted. Livestock that had been carefully managed before the plague often went feral in its aftermath, creating herds of wild or semi-wild cattle, pigs, and sheep that could be hunted or recaptured as needed. Dogs and cats, which had lived in close association with humans, sometimes formed feral populations as well, adapting to life without human support. The domestic wild boundary, like so many other boundaries in the post-plague world, became permeable and uncertain. Horse populations were particularly affected. Horses were essential for agriculture, transportation, and warfare, but they were also expensive to maintain. With reduced populations and resources, maintaining horse herds was challenging. Yet horses were also valuable, and those who could breed and train them found ready markets for their animals. The breeding of horses became both more important and more specialized in the decades after the plague. Political structures had to adapt to dramatically changed circumstances. Kingdoms and principalities that had lost significant portions of their populations found it harder to field armies, collect taxes, and maintain control over their territories. Some regions descended into chaos as local strongmen filled power vacuums. Others saw central authorities strengthen as they adapted to new realities and consolidated control. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which had begun in 1337, continued through the plague and its aftermath, adding another layer of devastation to regions already suffering from disease. The warfare itself changed character as armies shrank and could no longer be sustained in the field for long campaigns. Smaller, more mobile forces became the norm, raiding and pillaging rather than fighting set-piece battles. The conduct of war became more brutal in some ways. With populations reduced and manpower scarce, the value of prisoners for ransom diminished. Soldiers might be more willing to kill rather than capture, to destroy rather than occupy. The chivalric ideals that had supposedly governed warfare were further undermined by the realities of a world where survival often meant ruthlessness. Yet warfare also became less frequent in some regions, as lords lacked the resources to sustain it. The private wars between nobles that had been a constant feature of medieval life became less common, not because of any new commitment to peace, but because the plague had made them too expensive in both treasure and blood. This unintended reduction in local violence was one of the plague's few positive consequences. Taxation became a contentious issue as governments tried to maintain revenue from reduced populations. Tax collectors trying to extract the same total revenue from fewer people meant individual tax burdens increased significantly. This prompted resistance, evasion, and eventually rebellion in some areas. The peasants' revolt in England was triggered in part by a poll tax that fell equally on rich and poor, demanding payment that many could not afford. Government bureaucracies had to rebuild after plague killed many officials and disrupted record-keeping. Administrative continuity, which depended on experienced clerks and established procedures, was broken. New officials had to learn their roles without adequate training from predecessors who had died. Records were lost or corrupted. The machinery of government, never particularly efficient in the best of times, became even more haphazard in the plague's wake. Some regions experimented with new forms of government in response to the plague's disruptions. Cities that had been controlled by narrow oligarchies found themselves forced to broaden participation as old ruling families died out. Guilds and merchant associations gained political power, demanding a voice in governance in exchange for their economic contributions. These shifts toward more participatory forms of government were often resisted and sometimes reversed, but they planted seeds that would flower in later centuries. The legal profession faced its own transformations. With so many cases to adjudicate and so much property in dispute, lawyers found abundant work. Legal education, which had been disrupted by the plague's impact on universities, had to be reconstituted. The practice of law became more lucrative and more accessible, as the shortage of trained lawyers meant people with partial training could practice, learning as they went. Banking and finance evolved in the post-plague economy. Merchants needed credit to restart trade. Landowners needed loans to maintain their estates with reduced incomes. Workers might borrow to start their own enterprises. Banks that had survived the plague found new opportunities, but also new risks, as the economic volatility of the post-plague world made lending more precarious. Interest rates fluctuated wildly as bankers tried to price risk in an uncertain world. The Church's prohibition on usury complicated matters, as did the question of what constituted a fair return on investment when normal business relationships had been upended. Some bankers made fortunes, others were ruined. The financial sector, like every other aspect of the economy, was being remade through trial and error. Insurance began to develop in more sophisticated forms as merchants sought to protect themselves against the increased risks of the post-plague world. Maritime insurance, which had existed in primitive forms before the plague, became more common and more complex. The mathematics of risk, the attempt to quantify uncertainty and price protection against it, advanced as economic necessity drove innovation. Coinage and currency systems were disrupted by the plague's demographic catastrophe. The relationship between the money supply and the size of the economy shifted dramatically. With populations reduced but the amount of gold and silver in circulation relatively unchanged, the result was inflation in some regions, deflation in others, depending on local circumstances. Governments tried to manage their currencies, but often lacked the understanding or the tools to do so effectively. The accumulation of wealth became easier for some in the post-plague world, as inheritances concentrated property in fewer hands, and opportunities for profit multiplied for those with capital and connections. A merchant who survived with their network intact might find themselves dominating a trade that had previously supported dozens of competitors. A landowner who could afford to wait out the labor shortage might ultimately profit enormously from rising rents and land values. Yet wealth was also more precarious. The social and political instability of the post-plague world meant that fortunes could be lost as quickly as they were made. A merchant whose ships were seized by pirates or whose warehouses were looted in a riot might be ruined overnight. A landowner who faced peasant rebellion might find their manors burned and their rents uncollectible. The potential for both great gain and great loss made the post-plague economy volatile and unpredictable. Consumption patterns changed as survivors found themselves with more resources than they had expected. People who would have lived frugally before the plague might now be able to afford luxuries, better food, finer clothing, more comfortable housing. This increase in consumption had economic ripple effects, creating demand for goods that stimulated production and trade. Sumptuary laws, which attempted to regulate what people of different social classes could wear or consume, proliferated in the decades after the plague. These laws were partly about maintaining social distinctions in a world where economic changes were blurring them. If a merchant's wife dressed as well as a noble's wife, how could you tell them apart? The laws were largely ineffective. People violated them regularly, and enforcement was sporadic, but their existence showed how anxious authorities were about maintaining traditional hierarchies. The question of luxury versus necessity became complicated in a world where yesterday's luxuries might be today's commonplace goods, spices, fine fabrics, metal goods that had been rare and expensive before the plague became more accessible. As trade recovered and populations remained low, what did it mean for social order when peasants ate white bread and wore colored cloth? when servants owned multiple outfits, when ordinary people possessed goods that would have marked them as wealthy in an earlier time. Cultural anxiety about this inversion of expectations appeared in sermons and literature. Preachers denounced the vanity and pride of people who dressed above their station. Writers satirized social climbers and nouveau riche merchants who tried to ape noble manners. These denunciations revealed deep unease about social changes that seemed to threaten the natural order of things. Yet for those experiencing upward mobility, the post-plague world offered opportunities their ancestors could not have imagined. A peasant's grandson might become a guild master. A serf's daughter might marry a free man and see her children born into freedom. A merchant's son might marry into minor nobility, beginning a dynasty that would eventually erase its common origins. These individual trajectories of advancement, impossible or nearly so before the plague, became almost commonplace in its aftermath. The physical rebuilding of communities proceeded slowly and unevenly. Some villages that had been abandoned were eventually reoccupied as populations recovered. Others remained empty, their buildings gradually collapsing, their fields returning to forest. In cities, abandoned districts might be torn down and rebuilt to different plans, or left as ruins among inhabited areas, ghostly reminders of how much had been lost. Church buildings received particular attention in rebuilding efforts. Parishes that had lost their churches or found them in disrepair organized rebuilding campaigns, raising funds through donations, bequests, and special taxes. These reconstruction efforts created work for masons, carpenters, and craftsmen, stimulating local economies. The rebuilt churches often incorporated architectural innovations, like larger windows and more elaborate decoration, reflecting both new aesthetic preferences and the desire to create monuments worthy of survival. Domestic architecture evolved as well, with improvements in comfort and functionality. Houses built or renovated in the post-plague period often had better chimneys, more windows, more private spaces. The wealth accumulated by survivors allowed them to invest in their homes in ways that would have been impossible before. A craftsman's house in the late 14th century might have amenities that a minor noble's house had lacked 50 years earlier. The organization of urban space changed as cities rebuilt. Streets might be widened, sanitation improved, public spaces created. Some cities used the plague's devastation as an opportunity to rationalize their layouts, to create the more orderly urban environments that earlier, denser populations had made impossible. Others simply rebuilt what had been there before, maintaining traditional patterns even as populations remained far below pre-plague levels. Memory of the plague itself began to fade, even as its consequences continued to shape society. By the end of the 14th century, a generation had grown up with no direct memory of the pestilence. For them, the empty villages and restructured social order were simply the world as it had always been. The plague had passed from lived experience into history, from trauma into story. Yet the stories people told about the plague revealed much about how they understood what had happened. Some narratives emphasized divine punishment and repentance, seeing the plague as God's judgment on a sinful world, and survival as a call to righteous living. Others focused on human tragedy and resilience, on the suffering endured and the strength required to carry on. Still others saw the plague as simply inexplicable, a catastrophe beyond human understanding that had to be accepted rather than explained. These different narratives coexisted, each offering a framework for making sense of the incomprehensible. A person might believe simultaneously that the plague had been divine punishment, that it had struck randomly without regard to virtue, and that it remained fundamentally mysterious. These contradictions were not necessarily troubling. They reflected the inadequacy of any single explanation to encompass the magnitude of what had occurred. Artistic representations of the plague itself were relatively rare in the immediate aftermath, perhaps because the experience was too fresh, too painful to confront directly. But as time passed, artists began to create works that engaged with plague themes. The danse macabre and transitombs have already been mentioned, but there were other forms as well. Paintings of plague saints, narrative cycles showing the progression of disease, allegorical representations of death as a skeletal figure claiming victims. The cultural memory of the plague would be shaped by these artistic representations, by the stories told and retold, by the commemorations and memorials that communities created. Over time, the reality of the plague years, the fear, the confusion, the desperate struggles to survive, would be transformed into something more coherent, more narratively satisfying. The messy, contingent reality of the post-plague world would be simplified into lessons and morals, into stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. But for those living through the years immediately after the plague, there was no clear narrative, no obvious lesson. There was only the daily work of survival, the effort to build lives and communities in a world that had been shattered and was only slowly, painfully reassembling itself. They did not know they were living through a historical epoch that future generations would study and analyze. They were simply trying to get through each day, to create something stable and meaningful from the ruins they had inherited. The resilience they showed, the creativity they brought to solving unprecedented problems, the communities they rebuilt, and the new social arrangements they negotiated, these were the real achievements of the post-plague years. Not the grand political events or the theological debates or the economic theories that would be retrospectively imposed on this period, but the millions of small acts of persistence and imagination by which ordinary people remade their world. By the end of the 14th century, Europe had been transformed. The population was still far below pre-plague levels and would not recover for more than a century. But the society that was emerging was recognizably different from what had come before. Serfdom was fading, replaced by wage labor and tenant farming. Cities were more important, both economically and politically. Vernacular languages and cultures were flourishing. Social mobility was greater. Women had more economic opportunities. The church's monopoly on spiritual authority was weakening. None of these changes were solely or even primarily the result of the plague. Many had roots in developments that preceded the pestilence. But the plague had acted as an accelerant, compressing changes that might have taken centuries into decades, breaking down resistance to transformation through sheer catastrophic force. The world the plague made possible was not necessarily better than what had come before. There had been terrible costs, irreplaceable losses, but it was different, and that difference would shape the course of European and eventually world history. The survivors of the plague had not chosen to live through catastrophe. They had not wanted to inherit a world of empty houses and abandoned fields, of graves beyond counting and losses beyond measuring. But having survived, they had made choices about what to do with their survival. They had worked and married and raised children. They had built and planted and created. They had mourned and remembered and carried on. In doing so, they had ensured that the plague's devastation was not the end of the story but a dark chapter in a much longer narrative. The years after the Great Dying were years of grief and hardship, of social conflict and economic struggle, but they were also years of possibility and transformation, when the rigid structures of medieval society loosened enough to allow new forms to emerge. The people who lived through these years could not have known what they were creating, could not have seen how the choices they made would ramify down through the centuries. They were simply trying to survive, to build lives worth living in the shadow of catastrophe. And survive they did. Not all of them, not easily, not without costs that would echo through generations, but they endured, adapted, and ultimately created something new from the ruins of the old. The world they built was the foundation for the Renaissance, for the Reformation, for the emergence of modernity. The plague had destroyed a world, but from that destruction came possibilities that the destroyed world had never contained. The last survivors of the plague, those who had actually lived through the worst years of the dying, would carry their memories to their graves. They would tell their grandchildren stories of the time before, of what had been lost, of how the world had changed. And their grandchildren would listen, perhaps, but for them those stories would be history, not memory. The world of the plague years would recede into the past, becoming something to be studied and commemorated rather than lived experience. But the consequences of those years, the changes wrought by catastrophe and forged in its aftermath, those would persist. The freedom the peasants had claimed would not be entirely surrendered even as populations recovered. The social mobility that had been created would not be completely reversed. The questions that had been raised about authority and hierarchy and justice would not be unasked. The world after the plague could never be the world before it, no matter how much some might wish for that return. The survivors had done what survivors must. They had carried on. They had taken the broken pieces of their world and assembled them into something that worked, that functioned, that allowed life to continue. It was not the same as what had been lost, could never be the same. But it was real, it was theirs. It was the world they would pass to their children and their children's children. And in passing it on and ensuring that humanity continued despite catastrophe, they had achieved something remarkable. These were the years nobody remembers, the decades of reconstruction and renegotiation, of grief and adaptation, of endings and beginnings. They were years without great battles or famous discoveries, years that left few monuments and fewer records. But they were the years when the medieval world ended and something new began to emerge, when ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances created the foundations for the world that would follow. The Great Dying had been a catastrophe beyond measure, but what came after was not simply catastrophe's continuation. It was also recovery, transformation, the stubborn human insistence on continuing despite everything. The survivors had looked at the ruins of their world and decided to build something new. And in that decision, in that daily work of reconstruction, they had ensured that the plague would not be the final word, only a turning point in a much longer story. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, as the generation that remembered the plague died and was replaced by those who knew it only as history, the world that was emerging from catastrophe began to take clearer shape. It would be a world shaped by the plague's consequences, by the social and economic and cultural changes that had been accelerated or enabled by catastrophe. But it would be more than that as well. It would be a world created by human choice and effort, by the collective decisions of millions of people about how to live, how to organize society, how to make meaning from experience. The years after the Great Dying were not glorious years. They were hard years, uncertain years, years of struggle and sorrow, but they were also years of resilience and creativity, of adaptation and transformation. They were the years when humanity proved that even the worst catastrophe was not the end, that survival was possible, that life would continue, and in continuing it would change, would grow, would become something new. These were the years nobody remembers. But they were the years that made the world we know. They were the years of survival and rebuilding, of mourning and moving forward, of endings that were also beginnings. They were the years after the Great Dying, when the living had to learn how to live again in a world transformed by death, and learn they did, slowly and painfully, but with a determination that would carry them forward into an uncertain but persistent future.